So I've got to watch about not being nervous. I'm afraid of heights, and after the last picture we saw, I'm just a little worried. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about the Electric Reliability Council of ERCOT of Texas, or ERCOT, just to get started. When you hear ERCOT, a lot of times you hear two different things. One, it's the region, the electrical power region that's primarily within the state of Texas. It doesn't cover all of Texas. Some of the panhandle and portions of East and far West Texas aren't electrically connected to the rest of Texas, except through some weak direct current ties. So one version of ERCOT is that electrical region. The second thing that you hear about is the ERCOT Independent System Operator, which is the company I work for. It's an entity that was set up by the legislature to do certain activities, maintain reliability of the system, facilitate the wholesale and retail markets, and ensure open access to transmission for market participants. Now, just to be clear, ERCOT doesn't own generation, we don't own transmission, we don't actually serve retail load, we operate the system and plan the system. And in that, so the caveat here is that ERCOT doesn't advocate for any particular resource type or anything like that. So as we talk more about this, I think it'll become clear why I brought that up. There is a lot of wind generation already installed in Texas. As you can see here, we've got a little short of 10,000 megawatts already on the ERCOT system in terms of the nameplate capacity. Wind power generated about 8.5% of the electricity consumed within the ERCOT region in 2011. It's a pretty sizable amount. We've also done a lot of work already to facilitate additional wind connections to the system. This currently illustrates the current 345 kV network in ERCOT, but as I mash the button, you'll see the CREZ system, the Competitive Renewable Energy Zones network that's being developed. It's about $6.7 billion of current costs, current cost estimate of that new transmission network that's being set up really to get out to where the primary wind areas are, where some of the highest capacity factor wind, mostly up in the Panhandle and in far West Texas. Most of the current wind farms that exist are in that area, although there are beginning to be some along the Gulf Coast and in South Texas. ERCOT's also, because we have so much wind, we've also already worked through a lot of the issues that the other regions of the country are starting to work on related to how do you operate a system with that much intermittent and inverter connected power to the system. Operations issues, we've set up a forecasting mechanism to project what power is going to be available for the next hour up through the next day, and also a ramp forecast. And I've got a graph here in a minute that'll show why it's important to forecast when the wind is going to ramp up or down. The challenge that was posed to the panel is, what would it take to have a higher proportion of the wind generation of the electricity produced in the state produced by wind? What would it take to make that happen? Now, the answer to that really lies in whether that package, a system where there's more wind power connected, would be economic or not, because we have a market for wholesale power, and developers decide what they're going to build. You already heard from Dick a little bit about what the economics of wind are, but of course that depends also on what the other resources are on the system, the market environment. So what I specifically want to talk about primarily is kind of some of the operational requirements that affect the economics of wind in the market. Now, this discussion is obviously not going to be comprehensive. There are whole conferences on how do you integrate more wind power into the system. We won't go into all those details. An important thing to realize is that from an instantaneous standpoint, at all points in time, you've got to balance the load on the system and the generation on the system. In ERCOT, what that means, it's kind of like if you're in your car and you're going through hilly terrain, you've always got to be either accelerating or decelerating, putting more gas or less gas, or your car's going to speed up or slow down. The same thing happens with the frequency on the system. If you put a little too much generation in, the frequency starts to speed up, not enough, and it slows down. If you get out too far away from 60 hertz, things start to trip off. Generators aren't built to go too fast, or motors aren't built to go too fast or too slow. So an important concept that we need to bring up. Now, wind power, what you see here is the green graph. This is for a week. The hourly output of the green is the aggregate wind generation on the ERCOT system. The blue is the aggregate, I got it backwards. Green is load, blue is the aggregate wind power. As you can see, wind doesn't necessarily blow when consumers need the generation. The load is up in the afternoons. The wind generally is up in the morning and really early morning hours at its maximum output. On a peak day, when it's really hot across the whole state, in Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, you really get to a summer peak type day, and this particular is our hottest day, or our peak load day ever this past August. The wind doesn't necessarily produce much. In fact, in this case, it wasn't producing much for most of the day. You can see, just from an educational standpoint, we've got at the kind of the bottom of the stack there the cheaper variable power sources, nuclear and coal. Wind obviously has zero variable cost, but a lot of the swing in the load as everybody's air conditioner turns on as the day goes on is covered by the natural gas. The other thing I wanted to point out on this slide is the price in the wholesale market. It's pretty low most of the time, but if you get really tight on capacity where you barely have enough generation to cover the load, the prices go up to what's the system offer cap of $3,000. And so there's a big difference if you're tight on capacity, and that makes a big difference in the economics of your generation. If you can produce when things are tight, when the load is high, you're going to make a whole lot more money. The green that you see there, in fact, a lot of that is the reason we're seeing a lot more development of the coastal wind facilities is because the wind down there tends to blow more in the afternoon, in the middle of the day, than as compared to the West Texas wind, which doesn't blow much at that time of day, is blowing more in the morning. The other thing that happens with wind is sometimes it's not really controllable, and it's subject to when the wind blows, right? And you can see a day here where the aggregate wind power on the system dropped off by about nearly 4,000 megawatts within an hour. What that means is that you have to have other generation on the system that's online or can start quickly and ramps up to meet the load. In this case, as the wind was dropping off, and you can see the gray there is the aggregate system load. Essentially, the wind dropped off at the same time that the load was picking up. And so you've got to essentially ramp up the other generation sufficiently to match the amount that the wind was dropping off and the load was picking up. And this particular day is interesting also because the wind was at a pretty high output. We had to keep enough gas generation online to cover that drop-off in wind and to pick up for the next day, because the other generation, the gas generation on the system is not necessarily flexible in terms of how quickly it can start, how quickly it can ramp, and so forth. So because we had to keep all that gas generation online, we had to back off the coal generation. And so that inflexibility in the other resources on the system may be leading to a inefficient, at least in real-time type result in the dispatch. Now, we have a wholesale power market. Through time, those kind of inefficiencies are going to get worked out by the market, and the resource mix will change. And so some of the rest of what I want to talk about is, because that's what's going to be needed if we were under this thought paradigm that we want to integrate a lot more wind into the system, we're going to have a system where all the resources fit together to meet those become the most economic set of resources. So essentially, you'd need the system as a whole to balance those intermittent characteristics of the wind. So what are some of the other types of resources that could allow you to balance those unique characteristics of the wind? There's really two types. You can either have additional supply-side resources, additional generation that will help, or you can modify what the consumer behavior is, because in past, the demand, essentially we've used our air conditioning, we've charged up our iPads, whatever, whenever we wanted to, with kind of, because you're getting charged an average rate no matter when you use the electricity. So some of the alternatives on the supply side are quick start combustion turbines, so that we're not having to keep on that generation at night, but you can ramp them up quickly when either the wind drops off or just for the normal ramp purposes. It's additional flexibility. Dick talked a little bit about storage, and of course that is kind of the holy grail of the power business, to be able to have to store it and generate it when it's the cheapest and use it when it's needed. You got long cycle storage like compressed air. I heard about a new type of compressed or pumped storage today, last week, where you drill a big well, you fill it with water, you put a big chunk of concrete on top, and essentially you pump it, pressurize it so that the concrete gets pushed up when the power is cheap, and then you let it discharge and turn a turbine when the power is down. We haven't thought a lot about pump storage in the ERCOT region because we're fairly flat. Usually that's where you've got a big lake that you're pumping up to and now, but this would be a way to use the geology of Texas to make it work. Compressed air does the same kind of thing except with air. There's also batteries, flywheels, those kind of things. From a demand response standpoint, we're working much more toward using having more price-sensitive load where consumers are using the power when it's cheap, when the wind's blowing or whatever, so that you're trying to use more during the off-peak periods. At least, and then there's also the idea of controlled demand response, so that when the power really gets tight, when we're tight on supply and that price goes up to $3,000 like you saw in the earlier graph, you can cycle people's air conditioning, cycle their water heaters off, and those kind of things. It's a traditional program, but in a market where the differential between the prices is much more significant, the economics of those kind of programs make more sense. And then the other thing that we specifically from an ERCOT perspective need to do is make sure that our market rules are set up such that we facilitate the use of these other kinds of resources, and that we're not unintentionally setting those rules up so that they work with traditional resources, but may harm the implementation of the new type. So we've got work groups that are working on looking at those market rules and making sure that we've got them set up in such a way to facilitate these resources. And then finally, so kind of in the aggregate, we've got to have a system that works and is economic for all these types of resources to enter the market. This graph shows the incremental interconnection requests for new generation into the ERCOT system for the last several years. And you can see a big spike in new generation requests, both for wind, for gas, even for coal, and even a couple of nuclear plants, when gas prices were really high. But the red line there shows kind of the Henry Hub average gas prices, and as you can see, as the gas prices have dropped down, the economics of generation in the market has dropped significantly, and so has the number of interconnection requests. So new plans to build power plants in the ERCOT market as the gas prices have come down. Interestingly, you see solar taking off, but that's kind of because the technology economics is changing and becoming lower. But generally, we've seen a lot fewer requests. And so the blue box here shows the total amount of wind that's currently under development in ERCOT. At one point back in 2007, that number was up to about 50,000 megawatts, a little over 50,000 megawatts. We've dropped down now to less than 20 that's currently under development, and some of those may not really be actively under development with the gas prices that are there today. So hopefully that gave you an overview of how wind could fit into the system in a more economic way.